Hello and welcome to Adventure Light. My name is Tom and today I'm going to be reviewing this 5-sided tarp that I bought from AliExpress for £40 that bears more than a passing resemblance to the Mountain Laurel Designs Trailstar. So in the next couple of weeks I'm hoping to get my hands on an original Mountain Laurel Designs Trailstar tarp so I can do a direct comparison between this cheaper version and the original. If that's something you'd be interested in, then make sure you press the subscribe button and you'll get an alert when that video comes out. The weather has turned really foul. You can hear the rain, see it bouncing down. I would say this is about as good a test for the tarp as you can get. So this tarp is available in 3 colours: green, orange and grey. The green is a 15 denier sil nylon. The grey and the orange I believe are 20 denier sil nylons. So if you want something ultralight, go for the green. If you're looking for something that's a bit sturdier and might last you longer but weighs a bit more, go for the orange or the grey. On the AliExpress website it says that the green weighs 520 grams. I weighed it on my own scales and it came out at 575, so a little bit of a discrepancy but close enough, I guess. It comes in this stuff sack, which to be honest I think could probably do with being a little bit bigger, because when the tarp is wet it's actually quite hard to get in here. The tarp came with 10 aluminium shepherd's crook type tent pegs. I've got to admit I've given those away because I tend to use Eastern nano pegs with all of my tarps and tents, so I can't show those to you, I'm afraid. However, I noticed that recently AliExpress seemed to be selling the tarp with something that looks a little bit like an MSR mini groundhog. So if you order one today you may get something that looks a little bit more like this. So let's have a look inside, see what we've got. So as I said earlier, this is a 5-sided tarp. Each side is 2.2 meters in length, and at its widest point it is 3.7 meters across. There is guy out points on each of the corners and between each of the corners, and it comes with an orange guy line that looks like this with reflective bits in. Feels really strong, but I have replaced it with a thicker guy line and I'll talk about that later. The seams are double stitched along the edges and along the bits joining the fabrics. But you'll notice that where they put reinforcement on the corners, they've just used single stitching. So again, I'll talk about that later. The seams do not come taped or sealed. The tarp that I got came with a tube of silicone sealant and a little brush so that you can seal the seams yourself. However, I have noticed that on AliExpress they seem to be showing that the seams might be coming taped on the newer models. So again, if you order one today, you may find that your tarp comes with taped seams. Also on the newer models, I've noticed that the reinforcement on the corners appears to be laminated on as opposed to stitched on. So it may be that that's a bit stronger and a bit better as well. Okay, so that's the tarp. Let's have a go at putting it up and see what different setups we can use. So there's 2 main pitches that I tend to use with this tarp. One I call the storm pitch, which is a very low slung pitch, very good at shedding the wind, very good in bad weather. And the other is one that I call the open pitch, which I use if the weather's going to be good and I want to take in the views. So this is what it looks like inside the storm pitch. You can see I've got enough space for my head. Some people might prefer to pitch it a little lower to make it more wind resistant, and if the weather conditions were really bad, I'd probably do that. I found that it's best to sleep along the length of the tarp like this. I find there's more space than if I try sleeping across, where I find the line of the roof tends to get in the way a bit more. As you can see, there's absolutely tons of space, enough for 2 people or 1 person and a dog. Plenty of space to cook in here, plenty of space for all your gear, and if the weather's really bad, you could have you and a few of your friends in here playing cards or whatever. So it's a really nice space. The only drawback I would say is that the entrance is quite low and you do have to crawl in sometimes on your knees, so you can end up getting wet or muddy knees sometimes. So this is what it's like inside the open pitch. As you can see, there's a lot more headroom than in the storm pitch. It's a lot easier to get in and out. You don't have to crawl. And interestingly, although it's got a smaller footprint, it is actually possible to sleep across the tarp like this, because the walls are just that little bit steeper, so you don't tend to be brushing against them. Because you can sleep across the tent, I often use an inner tent made by 3FUL, which is a company that sells on AliExpress, and I tend to put it in that back corner there. I will be reviewing that in a later video, so again, if that's something you're interested in, make sure you subscribe so you get an alert when that comes out. Other good things about this tent, obviously the view is massive, it's brilliant, and yeah, it's just a lot more user friendly, so if I can get away with it, I tend to use this pitch. So I've had this tarp for about 2 years now, and the more I use it, the more I have grown to love it. But there's a few things that I've learned along the way which I'm going to share with you. The first thing is get some decent trekking poles. When I bought this tent, I was not a trekking pole user, so I went out to Amazon and bought the cheapest lightweight trekking poles I could buy, and they were really not up to the task. They used to collapse on themselves when I was pitching the tent, and on one occasion they actually snapped in half on a particularly windy night, which was miserable for me because I had to hike off the hills in the rain, in the wind, soaking wet, and I was cursing the tarp, but really what I should have been doing is cursing the trekking poles that I was using. Subsequent to that, I bought some pacer poles, which are these amazing trekking poles which come with an ergonomic handle and really take the weight off your knees. Again, I'll be doing a review on those at a later date if you're interested, so make sure you subscribe. But another great thing about those poles is that they are really sturdy. They're designed to be very strong, and they can cope with all the tension and the strains that you put on them when you're pitching a tarp like this. Now, a lot of people are really into ultralight, and they go for the lightest weight trekking poles that they can find. I would be wary of doing that because they may not be able to cope with the stresses and the strains that you're going to place on them. And remember, if you're using trekking poles, you should be carrying them in your hands anyway, so it's not weight on your back, it's actually taking weight off your feet. So make sure you get some good sturdy trekking poles to cope with the stresses that you're going to be putting on them. The other thing I would do is I would not use the pegs that come with a tent, but I would go out and get yourself the best pegs that you can buy. And in my mind, it's the Eastern Nano pegs. They are quite tricky to get hold of if you live outside of the United States. You will have to get them imported, and you may have to pay import duty, but I think it's worth it. With a tarp like this, it's not a self-supporting structure, and the pegs are absolutely crucial in keeping it taut, in keeping it up. It's absolutely crucial that you use the best pegging points that you can. Buzz off fly. So get yourself some Eastern pegs, and again, I'll be doing reviews on pegs at a later date, so if that's something you're interested in, make sure you subscribe. And once you've got a set of these, you can use them for all your tarps, all your tents, and you'll not regret it. Another thing I would recommend you do is the guy lines that came with this tarp originally were very, very thin orange guy lines. They look great, but they're just too thin for the line locks which are attached to this tent, and they kept slipping. I would be sleeping and all of a sudden one side of the tent would just become very, very saggy. I'd have to get out in the middle of the night in the rain and the wind and tighten them up, and it did my head in. Even if I put a hitch knot in, it would sometimes still come loose. So what I did subsequently is I took out all the guy lines and I replaced them with a fatter cord, which means that they don't slip. It does mean they're a little bit stiffer when you try and tighten them, but it is worth it. Another thing I would do when you get hold of this tarp is on one of the corners there is a very, very long guy line. Now the idea is that you use this guy line at the front of the tent to make the porch and the ridge line, but it kind of defeats the object of this tarp, I think, because it limits how many pitches you can use. So it limits you to the storm pitch. So one of the first things I did was to cut the guy line and make all the guy lines the same length, and then I've got that spare piece of cord which I can use obviously to attach to the trekking pole at the front to make the ridge line. The other good thing about cutting the long cord is that you don't have to fish around looking for the back or the front of the tarp. You just pull it out, pick any corner to make the back of the tarp, and then just crack on. So there's no fishing around trying to find the back or the front or anything like that. Now, as I said, the tarp does not come with taped seams. They're not sealed. You have to do that yourself, and I was provided with a tube of silicone sealant. Now, I haven't sealed the seams, and I think that's probably just because I've not had the time or I'm lazy, but to be honest, I've not had any problems with this tent, and the rain has not come in through the seams. And there is a clip which I'm just going to show you now. It's been raining for, oh blimey, probably 3 or 4 hours, pretty heavily, and there doesn't appear to be any water ingress at all. The walls are dry as a bone, and the seams, which I haven't even sealed yet, absolutely bone dry. So yeah, it's performing really well. One place I would seal it is on the peak, because I've noticed that right at the peak, when the tarp is under tension, you can see some little spots of sunlight, and obviously that's going to be one place where water can get in. So make sure if you're going to seal the tarp, seal it at the peak. And the final thing I would do when I pitch this tent is use 2 guy lines at the front, and I mentioned with the storm pitch that helps prevent lateral movement. It's a small thing, but it just does make that front pole that little bit more sturdy, so I'd recommend you do that as well. So what are the pros and the cons of this tarp? Well, as far as the pros are concerned, it is really lightweight, it packs down really small, it's really versatile, you can pitch it in all sorts of different ways. It's very spacious. It would happily fit 2 adults or even 3 adults at a push. Great thing about tarps is that you feel really in touch with nature. The view out the front is great. And perhaps the best thing of all is that it's only £40. So if you buy it and you don't like it, you've not really lost much. You can always stick it on eBay and get some of your money back. As far as the cons are concerned, it can be a little bit tricky to learn how to pitch at first, and it needs a bit of practice, so I'd recommend going in your garden and getting some practice. It does require trekking poles, so if you're not a trekking pole user and you never wish to use them, don't bother with this tent. The other problems with it are probably to do with workmanship. As I mentioned at the beginning, there is single stitching where the reinforced fabric has been put on the corners and on the peak, and where the single stitching has been used, the fabric has started to come away in places, and so there is some issues with workmanship. And as far as the fabric is concerned, with the tarp bag that you put it in, I've actually managed to put the pegs through the tarp bag on a number of occasions, and that's something that I've never done before with any other materials that I've used when I've been camping. So there is a little bit of a question mark over the fabrics that have been used. So there is some cons, but I would say that the pros outweigh the cons. Okay, so is this tarp for you? Well, if you're the kind of hiker who has only ever used a tent, and you're thinking of perhaps going more ultralight, or you want to try and use a tarp, then this is perfect, because it's somewhere between a tarp and a tent. And you'll notice that throughout the video I have sometimes referred to it as a tarp, sometimes referred to it as a tent, and it's because it's kind of somewhere in the middle. If you are somebody who already uses trekking poles, or somebody who plans to use trekking poles, again, this would be a really good option. But if you're the kind of person who absolutely swears you're never going to see or use a trekking pole, then steer clear, because you do need them to pitch them. So if I was to score this tent out of 10, I would give it a very respectable 7. That is the end of today's video. Thank you very much for watching Adventure Light. Until next time, see you soon.